Alright, let's go. Number 8. Cairo hashish. In the 1250s, Mamluk authorities in Cairo issued an emergency edict ordering the destruction of every hashish crop within the city's agricultural districts. It was not the first such edict. It was not the second. By the time this order reached the hands of local administrators, it was at least the third attempt in living memory to stamp out a substance that had quietly consumed entire neighborhoods, and it failed just as completely as the ones before it. The chronicler al-Maqrizi, writing in the early 15th century, looked back at what Cairo's districts had become and chose his words with care. Hashish had moved through Cairo's population for generations before the crisis became impossible to ignore. In the medieval Islamic world, its use was documented, debated, and condemned by scholars including Ibn Khaldun, who described in his Muqaddimah the particular devastation it visited upon the urban poor. Cairo in the 13th century was one of the largest cities in the world, a functioning agaric capital of extraordinary complexity, home to markets and mosques, and a legal infrastructure that touched almost every aspect of daily life. The substance did not erase it all. It erased specific places, specific streets, specific communities, one at a time. What al-Maqrizi documented in his encyclopedic account of Cairo's quarters was the condition of Al-Karafa, the city of the dead, a vast cemetery district that had long housed the living poor alongside the graves of the wealthy. By the later 13th century, the boundary between the inhabited city and the abandoned one had dissolved in Al-Karafa in a way that struck even hardened urban observers as wrong. The living had adopted the habits of the dead, withdrawing from commerce, from prayer attendance, from the visible structures of civic life, settling into a consuming stillness that the chroniclers found deeply unsettling to describe. Al-Maqrizi recorded entire blocks where no functioning commerce remained, where the rhythm of the market had simply stopped. Ibn Khaldun connected this pattern explicitly to hashish consumption among the laboring poor, describing it not as a moral failing of individuals, but as a consuming force that moved through communities the way contaminated water moves through a district's wells. The Mamluk edicts acknowledged the scale of the problem even as they failed to address it. 3 suppression campaigns documented across the administrative record, each one erasing its own evidence of failure within a few years of its announcement. 3 edicts, and the streets of Al-Karafa kept emptying. What does it say about a substance when the most powerful administration in the medieval Islamic world looked at what it was doing to its own capital and concluded, after decades of effort, that they simply could not stop it? Number 7. Paris mandrake. In the years following the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, parish priests in the districts surrounding the Rue Saint-Denis in Paris began recording deaths that resisted the standard categories available to them. The men and women dying in their parishes had not starved, though starvation had recently passed through the city like a tide. They had not died of fever in any form the priest recognized. They had consumed something prescribed to them in many cases, something sold to them by apothecaries operating within the shadow of the most celebrated medical faculty in Europe, and it had killed them in ways that the church's burial records were not designed to capture honestly. The University of Paris Faculty of Medicine was, by the early 14th century, the dominant medical authority in Northern Europe. Henri de Monville, royal surgeon and one of the period's most significant medical writers, had completed his influential work, Chirurgy, in the years around 1306 to 1320, a text that addressed plant-based anesthetics with clinical seriousness, including mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, a root containing scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, all deliriant compounds with a lethal dose poorly separated from a medicinal one. The faculty knew what mandrake did. They prescribed it anyway, because in the famine's aftermath, the poor of Paris needed something for pain, and mandrake was what the apothecaries had. What the parish records of the Rue Saint-Denis district began to show in the years after the famine was a pattern that the priests found difficult to write down plainly. Parishioners were dying in a waking state that was not waking, speaking to people who were not present, warm to the touch and breathing and utterly unreachable, until they stopped breathing entirely. The faculty's own understanding of dosage was imprecise. The apothecary's measurements were more imprecise still. Every batch of mandrake preparation was different, every patient's tolerance different, and the consequences of that variation were being buried in the churchyards of the right bank at a rate that unsettled even those doing the burying. What makes this episode particularly contaminated by institutional failure is the direction of the poison's flow. The substance killing the poor of the Rue Saint-Denis district was not something they had sought out against medical advice. It was something that the physicians of Paris had recommended, that the apothecaries had prepared, and that the faculty had implicitly endorsed through its silence on the matter of dosage and dispensing standards. The famine had created the demand. The medical establishment had supplied the means. The parish priests were left to find appropriate words for what to write on the burial certificates. The Faculty of Medicine's response to the crisis, if one existed, has not survived in the documentary record. The parish burial records have survived. They tell a story that medicine in the early 14th century preferred not to document, that the substance finishing what the famine had started was, in many cases, the same one the doctors had prescribed. Number 6. Venice opium. Senate records from Venice in the second half of the 14th century document repeated debates about what the Republic's administrators carefully called the question of Levantine medicines, a phrase that appears across multiple deliberations and always means the same thing. Venice had built a significant portion of its pharmaceutical fortune on the opium trade arriving via eastern Mediterranean routes, taxed it, regulated it in the loosest possible sense, and distributed it across Europe through the commercial networks that made the Republic the envy of every competing power. By the 1360s and 1370s, the Provveditori alla Sanità, Venice's health magistrates, were producing reports that the Senate found inconvenient to act upon. Venice's dominance of the European opium trade in the 14th century was not incidental to the Republic's identity. It was structural. The city controlled the Levantine pharmaceutical routes that brought opium westward, and it taxed that trade at every stage, creating a revenue stream that the Senate was constitutionally disinclined to interrupt. Michele Savonarola, the Venetian physician whose medical writings in the mid-15th century would become widely influential, and who was the grandfather of the more famous reforming friar, documented opium dependency in Venetian populations with a clinical precision that suggested he was describing something he had observed extensively and personally. The substance was everywhere, because Venice had put it there. What the health magistrates' reports described, in the language of administrative concern that the Venetian bureaucracy preferred to outright alarm, was the condition of specific island districts. The island of Giudecca, a residential quarter connected to the main city by water, was showing patterns that the magistrates' documents describe with a phrase that recurs across multiple entries: the sleep that does not end. Entire Calais, the narrow alleyways characteristic of Venetian urban geography, had gone quiet in ways that were not explained by plague or emigration. The district's economic activity was measurably declining in ways that the magistrates connected, in their reports, to laudanum dependency among the working population. The Senate voted, across multiple sessions in this period, to continue the taxation of the opium trade. The health magistrates' reports did not change this outcome. The revenue was too significant, the commercial relationships too embedded, and the ideological commitment to free trade too deeply held in a republic whose identity was built on being the broker between East and West. The magistrate who produced the most detailed reports on Giudecca's condition retired from public life before the last of these Senate votes was recorded. The archive does not explain why he retired. When a state knowingly profits from the substance consuming its own citizens, and the officials who document the harm are the ones who disappear from the record, the question is not whether the institution failed. The question is whether failure is even the right word for something that appears, in the surviving documents, to have been a considered choice. Number 5. London henbane. The London coroner's roll for the closing years of the 14th century contains entries from the district of Southwark that the coroners classified, with some consistency, as deaths from fever of an unspecified character. Southwark in this period was a particular kind of place. It sat on the south bank of the Thames, outside the jurisdiction of the City of London's guilds and courts, under the authority of the Bishop of Winchester's Manor Court, which administered what was politely called the Liberty of the Clink, a jurisdiction that encompassed the famous stews, the taverns, the bear-baiting arenas, and the apothecary stalls that operated without the oversight that their counterparts on the North Bank were required to accept. The fever entries in several cases are accompanied by marginal notations that appear to have been partially erased. John of Ardern, the English surgeon whose Practica, written around 1370, stands as one of the most significant English medical documents of the medieval period, had extensive knowledge of henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, a plant containing hyoscyamin and scopolamine that was widely used as a painkiller and sedative throughout medieval European medicine. Arderne understood its dangers. He wrote about the difficulty of dosage, the narrow margin between a dose that relieved pain and one that produced delirium, and the further narrow margin between delirium and death. What he could not control was the unlicensed trade in henbane preparations that flourished in jurisdictions like Southwark, where no guild held authority over what an apothecary stall could sell or how it prepared its stock. The Winchester Manor Court's records for Southwark, preserved in their partial form, contain a 1403 entry ordering the closure of specific stalls on Borough High Street for selling a substance described as rhubarb root that was not rhubarb root. This language, a deliberate administrative vagueness, appears in medical texts of the period as a known method for disguising henbane preparations sold to customers who might hesitate to purchase something with henbane's documented reputation. The stalls were selling it as a digestive remedy and a sleep aid. The court ordered their closure. It is not recorded that the order was successfully enforced. The demographic evidence from Southwark in this period is preserved in the subsidy rolls and poll tax records that survive in fragmentary form. The 1381 poll tax returns show declining populations in specific Southwark parishes. Later, 15th century subsidy assessments for parishes, including St. Margaret, show populations that the assessors described, using the standard administrative language of the period, as visited, a term that appears without further elaboration and with no plague outbreak recorded in those years to explain it. The populations in question were not reduced. They were, in the surviving rolls, simply gone. 3 specific parishes in Southwark record in the subsidy assessments of the early 15th century, populations that the assessors could not enumerate. The assessors noted the condition of these parishes with a single word and moved on to the next entry. Whatever had visited those streets, it had been thorough enough that the tax collectors saw no purpose in lingering over the details. Number 4. Baghdad Datura. When the Mongol armies of Hulagu Khan breached the walls of Baghdad in February 1258 and burned the House of Wisdom, they destroyed the greatest repository of medical knowledge in the medieval world, including, with a catastrophic irony that the chroniclers themselves seemed to sense, the text that might have told the survivors what they were consuming in the ruins. Rashid al-Din Hamadani, the Ilkhanate court historian whose Jami al-Tawarik, the compendium of chronicles completed around 1307, remains one of the most important sources for this period, described the post-siege city in terms that later readers have found difficult to interpret as purely political or military in character. Baghdad before 1258 was one of the largest cities in the world. Population estimates for the Abbasid capital range from 500,000 to 800,000 people, figures that place it among the most densely inhabited urban centers of the medieval period. The Arabic medical tradition had an extensive and sophisticated understanding of datura, known in the texts as Jaws matil, the numbing nut, a plant containing atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamin in concentrations that make it one of the most dangerous substances in the medieval pharmacopoeia. Physicians trained in the Abbasid tradition used datura as a surgical anesthetic under careful preparation and controlled dosage. The siege of 1258 killed or scattered those physicians. It did not remove the datura from the city's environment. What Rashid al-Din's chronicle describes in its account of the Kark district, the western bank of Baghdad, in the years following the siege, is a population that had ceased to function in ways that Ilkhanate administrators attempting to rebuild the tax base found deeply puzzling. Census takers sent into Kark returned with accounts of people who were present and could not be engaged, who sat in the ruins of their homes and could not answer questions, who appeared to be awake and were not reachable. This description, recorded in an administrative chronicle with no medical interpretive framework attached to it, matches the acute presentation of datura intoxication with a precision that several historians of Islamic medicine have noted in their analyses of this period. Al-Qazwini, writing in his cosmographic work Ajaib al-Maklukat around 1270, documented the properties of datura with the fascinated detail of a scholar who understood both its uses and its dangers. What the post-siege population of Baghdad lacked was anyone who had read al-Qazwini carefully enough to recognize what they were doing to themselves. The House of Wisdom had held those texts. Contemporary accounts record that the Tigris ran dark with the ink of its books for days after the burning. The people who needed that knowledge most were the ones standing on the riverbank watching it dissolve. When a city has already been half erased by conquest, and a substance erases the remainder, the historical record tends to attribute all of it to the conquest. The Mongol sack of Baghdad is one of the most documented catastrophes of the medieval world. What happened in Kark in the decades that followed is documented only in the puzzled notations of census takers who found people alive and unreachable, sitting in a city that had forgotten how to be a city. The distinction between those two causes of erasure matters less than the fact that by the end of the 13th century, both had done their work completely. Number 3, Kiev, fly agaric. In 1245, the Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine passed through Kiev on his way to the Mongol court, traveling as a papal envoy on a diplomatic mission of the highest importance, a man trained to observe and report with precision. He counted the houses still standing in the city. He counted approximately 200. Before the Mongol army of Batu Khan had passed through in 1240, Kiev had been one of the great cities of Eastern Europe, with a population that historians estimate in the tens of thousands, a functioning principality, a cathedral, and the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, the monastery of the caves, which was among the most significant religious institutions in the medieval Slavic world. Plano Carpini did not speculate about where the people had gone. He simply noted that they were not there. The Hypatian Chronicle, the primary chronicle of Kievan Ruzis, compiled at the Pechersk Lavra itself, documents the city's condition through the years following the Mongol passage, with an increasing sparseness that historians of this period read as significant in itself. The chronicle's entries for the Podil, Kiev's lower trading district, become notably thin in the years after 1240, recording less and less of the commercial and administrative activity that the same document had tracked with detail in earlier decades. Fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, had deep roots in the shamanic traditions of Eastern Europe and Siberia, documented in ethnobotanic accounts as a substance capable of producing states ranging from euphoric stillness to violent delirium, and it had found a place in the Lavra's own medicinal gardens before the siege made careful institutional control of that garden impossible. What the chronicle preserves in a passage that appears to be in a later hand than the surrounding text is a reference to monks of the Pechersk Lavra distributing what the text calls medicines against despair to the population of the Podil in the winter of 1241. This phrase has no parallel elsewhere in the document. Historians of Kievan Rus' have flagged it without resolving it. The Podil's population, which the chronicle had previously tracked through the economic rhythms of the trading district, largely disappears from the document's attention in the years that follow this entry. The trading records go quiet, the tax notations become sparse. Then they stop. Fly agaric's active compounds, ibotenic acid and muscimol, produce effects that contemporary accounts of berserker states in Norse sources describe with a consistency that pharmacologists studying the historical record have found credible. In a population that had survived a catastrophic siege, that had lost its political leadership, its administrative structure, and a significant portion of its adult population to Mongol violence, the appeal of a substance that offered oblivion, however contaminated and dangerous, was not mysterious. What was mysterious was the speed and completeness with which the Podol's population ceased to be recorded in any document produced by any institution that had previously tracked it carefully. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine was a careful man. He counted 200 houses. He had no reason to exaggerate the desolation he found, and he was traveling on papal business that required accurate reporting. He counted what was there. He did not count what was absent, because in Kiev in 1245, the absence was too large and too complete to enumerate. Number 2. Toledo wormwood. In the closing decade of the 13th century, the city of Toledo, seat of the Castilian archbishopric, home to the most celebrated translation schools in medieval Europe, the city where Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew scholarship had coexisted and cross-pollinated for 2 centuries, began emptying in a way that appeared in the royal administrative records only as a problem of declining tax revenue. The cathedral chapter records preserved in the Archivo de la Catedral de Toledo document rental income from the Juderia, the Jewish quarter surrounding the synagogues of Santa Maria la Blanca and El Tránsito, declining across the last years of the century. The chapter's accountants noted the decline without explanation, because no single explanation covered what was happening, and the explanations that did exist were not ones the chapter was inclined to put into its formal records. Wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, was embedded in Toledo's pharmaceutical culture in a way that reflected the city's unique multilingual identity. The plant had been documented in Arabic medical texts, in Hebrew pharmacological traditions, and in Latin herbals and Toledo's apothecaries, operating across all 3 communities, prepared wormwood-based drinks that were used as digestive remedies, pain relief, and, in the tavern culture of the city's lower districts, as recreational intoxicants whose thujon content, the compound responsible for wormwood's neurological effects, varied wildly between preparations and had no standardized safe limit in any medical tradition available at the time. High-dose thujone causes seizures, hallucinations, and progressive neurological damage. Under Sancho IV, whose reign ran from 1284 to 1295, royal decrees regulated tavern hours but explicitly exempted the crown's own revenue-generating establishments from closure orders. The cathedral chapter's rental records from the Juderia contain an entry from the years around 1297, noting that income from specific properties had fallen substantially over a 5-year period, not because tenants had been expelled or had emigrated, but because, as the entry states with an accountant's precision, the houses stood empty and no person came forward to claim or pay for them. This is a different kind of vacancy from political expulsion. Expulsion leaves forwarding addresses, legal disputes, property claims. The vacancy the chapter was recording was of the kind left by populations that had simply ceased to be present in sufficient numbers to transact business of any kind. What makes Toledo's wormwood crisis particularly devastating is its relationship to the persecutions that followed it. The city's 3 communities shared the same contaminated substance and faced 3 entirely different institutional responses, each of which made the situation worse rather than better. The Jewish community faced intensifying royal pressure under Sancho IV. The Moorish community faced its own accumulating legal restrictions. Neither community had access to a civic authority that was interested in addressing their survival as a priority. The wormwood moved through all 3 quarters. The authorities who might have intervened were, in each case, invested in the community's diminishment rather than their preservation. Toledo's wormwood epidemic did not survive long enough in the historical record to receive its own name. By the time the expulsions came, the violence of 1391 against the Jewish community and the royal decrees of 1502 against the Moorish population, there was almost no one left in those streets to expel. The epidemic had been so thorough and the institutional abandonment so complete that persecution arrived to find it had already done most of the work. What came next was not the cause of Toledo's erasure, it was the document that confirmed it. Number 1. Florence belladonna. In 1348, Florence lost somewhere between half and 2/3 of its entire population in the space of 12 months. Historians call this the Black Death, and they are not wrong. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived that year in the city and wrote the Decameron in its immediate aftermath, described physicians who had abandoned their patients, either through fear or through exhaustion, and streets where the dead outnumbered those capable of burying them. What the guild records of the Arte dei Medici e Speciali, the Physicians and Apothecaries Guild, preserved in the Archivio di Stato di Firenze, document alongside the plague is something that the historical literature on the Black Death has addressed only in fragments, a simultaneous catastrophic and almost entirely uncounted epidemic of belladonna poisoning that the physicians of Florence could not distinguish from the disease they were already failing to treat. Belladonna, Atropa belladonna, had a well-established place in Florentine medical culture by the 14th century. It was used as a cosmetic, dilating the pupils of Florentine women in a fashion that gave the plant its name, the beautiful lady. It was used as a surgical anesthetic, documented in Matthias Platerius's pharmacological reference text Circa Instance, the standard formulary in use across European medical education since the 12th century. It was also, critically, being sold by Florentine apothecaries in the years immediately before the plague's arrival as a prophylactic against infection, based on a misapplication of humoral medical theory that identified the plant's heating properties as protective against the cold, wet humoral imbalance that physicians associated with pestilential disease. The guild records show elevated belladonna preparation sales in the years 1347 and 1348, as apothecaries responded to a frightened population willing to consume almost anything that promised protection. What made the resulting epidemic invisible within the plague year is a fact of pharmacology rather than historical negligence. Belladonna contains atropine and scopolamine, and its acute poisoning symptoms include flushing, rapid heartbeat, delirium, and respiratory failure. Plague, in its septicemic and pneumonic forms, produces flushing, rapid heartbeat, delirium, and respiratory failure. A physician in Florence in 1348, working in conditions that Boccaccio describes as the complete collapse of normal medical practice, had no reliable means of distinguishing a patient dying from Yersinia pestis from a patient dying from atropine toxicity. Both patients looked the same. Both patients died. Both patients were buried in the same mass graves and counted in the same catastrophic tallies that historians have been analyzing for nearly 7 centuries. The guild records of the Arte dei Medici e Speciali, where they survived for this period, show belladonna preparation sales continuing through the plague year at elevated levels. They show the sales pattern changing in 1349, not because the epidemic was recognized and addressed, not because a physician identified the compound's role and issued a warning. The sales stopped because the customers were gone. Specific districts of Florence, the Gonfaloni of Santa Croce and Santo Spirito, show mortality patterns in the surviving burial records that scholars of medieval demographic history have noted as anomalous even within a year of catastrophic overall mortality. Patterns that the standard plague model does not fully account for in neighborhoods where the apothecary trade had been most concentrated and most active. The physicians of Florence in 1348 were selling the poison as the cure. They had no way of knowing this because the symptom overlap was complete and their diagnostic tools were not equal to the distinction. Boccaccio wrote that they had abandoned their patients. The guild records suggest something more precise and more disturbing than abandonment. They kept working, kept prescribing, kept filling the orders for a preparation that was finishing what the plague had started, right up until the ledger pages ran out of names to record. The most complete document of Florence's belladonna epidemic is not a medical report or a chronicle entry. It is the silence at the end of the apothecary accounts, the blank pages where the customers used to be. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.